Hello and welcome to episode 334 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum here at Camp Shelby. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many other postings. How are you on this very dreary April day, Bill?
Yeah, it's not too dreary here in Florida. In fact, it's
Never is.
wonderful. Yeah, it sometimes it is, but it's unusual. Hey, Seth, this last week I went to the Brevard County Veterans Museum on Merritt Island, not far from where I live. I was late getting there, and I saw something that really amazed me. First of all, it's a great museum if anybody wants to get there. And they have a great library. It included many books that we've covered, Seth. But the thing that really caught my attention is they have a little piece of the rope that Prime Minister Tojo was hung with. So apparently this was a thing, Seth. After they hung Tojo, they cut this rope up into little bitty pieces and handed it out to various dignitaries. Can you believe that?
I totally believe that because when I was at the World War II Museum, we had various pieces of morbid macabre artifacts like that in our collection too. We have a few things here at this museum that are kind of like, kind of creepy, but yeah, I could totally believe that. I don't think I'd put that out on display, but that's just me.
It was on display. Yeah.
To each his own. Well, if you're watching this, it's very obvious that we have a third member of the crew in here today, and we'd like to welcome our new guest to the show, that being Shawn Betgstrom. Shawn will be acting as the moderator for these next couple Q&A shows that we're doing, and will also be with us next season, in season 4, as we get into the China, Burma, India theater, which I know a lot of people are looking forward to. Shawn is an Army veteran. He's a United States Army veteran. He was a U.S. cavalry officer for over a decade with stops at the 1st Cav Division, 7th Cav, U.S. Armor School, and a deployment to the Middle East with the 153rd Cav Squadron before he finished his career as a military science instructor at Florida State University. And I also have to say he is quite literally, most positively, my oldest friend. We've known each other for 40 years. So welcome to the crew, Shawn, and we're glad to have you here.
It is a complete honor and privilege to be with both of you. I remember Seth talking about this podcast years ago and, his buddy Bill and getting together and doing this, and I thought it was extremely important. Seth has done so many interviews with several veterans and tell their stories and keep it going. I think that is so important. So I'm just honored, privileged to be here with both of you.
Well, we're glad to have you here.
Thank you, Shawn.
All right. Well, before we get started, we would like to ask you to like and subscribe to our channel as it helps other people find our show. If you have done so, thank you. If you haven't, please do so. This week, we're going to do things, quite obviously, a little bit different than we normally do. As I said earlier, Shawn is here to guide Bill and I as we move through the legions of questions that were sent to us by you guys. As always, 100% clarity on our part. We cannot answer every question that was sent to us. It was, I don't remember the number, but it was a lot.
Hundreds.
It was a ton.
Hundreds.
Yeah. It was a pile. It was a pile. So, there just simply isn't enough time. So please don't get offended if we don't answer your question. And if we do answer your question, cool, great. We went through them, Bill and I and Shawn, we went through them and we picked the ones. We did not pick softballs, I have to say. We did not. We picked questions that we could answer in a short amount of time without going into a dissertation. So, and that's another reason Shawn's here, is to basically shut me and Bill up when we start to ramble a little bit too long. So anyway, because, we never do that, Bill, do we? We never talk.
Never.
Never,
and,
ever.
And, Seth, I'd be surprised if we actually answer any of these questions. Shawn will ask them. Whether we answer them or not and give a correct and appropriate answer is another story.
A good point, Bill. That's a good point.
Indeed. Well, all right. Well, let's get started. Shawn, lay it on us, man. What do you got?
All right. So Bill, do I have the con?
You have the con. That's a good Navy expression for an Army guy. I'm proud of you.
Like that one.
Yep.
So just to expound a little bit on what Seth said, there's about 150 questions. I looked at every single question multiple times. So I found there was great World War II stories in there. There were great personal stories. And I just want to tell everybody that we all appreciate everything that you wrote to us. It was very heartfelt, a lot of these stories, but as Seth alluded to, what I tried to do here is I have the lead on this. So don't blame these two guys if your question isn't on there. Blame me.
But they will.
You can blame
Okay.
Shawn. No, not that. Don't give them a negative review. Blame Shawn. So what I did was I went through all of them multiple times, and we got about 45 to 50, and then we're going to try to get through as many of these as possible. So Seth also alluded there was a lot of questions about CBI. Next season we'll be looking at doing that. Seth, are you looking at doing another Q&A maybe next at the end of this, or what's your
thought? How many we get? That's the plan, is to do 2. It just depends on how many we get through, but we'll try. Yeah, that's the plan right now, is to do 2.
And then what about at the end of this? You think maybe throwing that out there as an idea?
I don't know, Bill. What do you think?
Yeah, sure. Why not?
Yeah.
There you go.
So
roll the dice.
Maybe we end with that. I don't know. So going forward, if there's another Q&A, I would highly encourage people that don't get their questions asked, rewrite Seth at the end of this. It would help to make the. It always helps if it's like 2 or 3 lines, right? Some of these questions were pages, literally.
Verbose. Yeah.
And I told Seth some of these questions were so dang good, we could do a podcast on them. So, that's why I was like, hey, if we do it again, just get it 2 or 3 questions. But appreciate everybody. Just wanted to get that out there before I started. This is the first question, and I'm gonna kind of answer this. So it's probably the most important question I found out of all the questions. So Bob on Facebook, and I'm going to be using first names. I'm going to try to leave people's last names out. Says, we have a pretty good description of Captain Bill's background, which is nothing short of amazing. But as they say, it takes 2 to tango. So I think we'd like to hear a little bit more about Seth's background story. I've read and listened to much over the years, but in my humble opinion, Seth more than holds his own with some pretty stellar historians. Thanks, guys. So I'm going to tell everybody that Seth spent 15 years to the day at the World War II Museum. He usually introduces people, so I'm going to introduce him today. You'd be hard-pressed to find anything in the World War II Museum without his hands on it. He helped build that place back when it was the D-Day Museum and transitioned to the World War II Museum. He's also spent, give me a ballpark, Seth, of how many veterans do you think you interviewed over the years?
Oh, God. Well over 1,000. I mean, I really don't. Yeah.
So, and most of those are documented, and
they're all documented. Yeah.
They're all documented. And you can, how would you access that, Seth? How could somebody?
You can't access them all. You can access, I mean, you could if you went there, but to the museum, but most of them, I say most, probably. So when we started, we had 25 oral histories. When I took over the department, when I left, we had over 5,000. So I would say there's probably about 40% online right now, I guess. I don't know. I'm not there anymore, so I don't know. Right. But some of them, a great many of the guys that we've talked about in the show are on there.
Right. So to answer the question, I would be hard pressed to find another person on the planet that has interviewed more World War II veterans than Seth has. So, and besides that, he is my good friend. And I think Bill would agree that he is above and beyond both of our skills level as far as recounting firsthand stories of the veterans.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Absolutely, no doubt about that. And Shawn, the only thing I would add is that, in the world of historians and academics in general, I would say that the best historians I knew, I've known personally, the most impactful, many of the best, most impactful, wouldn't you be able to teach at a university because they don't have that PhD thing, those letters after their name, which is ludicrous because, it's like operational engineers versus academic engineers who teach, right? The old saying, those who can do, those who can't teach. I hate to say that, but it's true in the world of historians, in my opinion. So Seth, you're one of the best historians on these things we cover in the world. And just, it's undervalued, I would say, because, like many of us don't have that PhD thing beyond our name.
Well, thank you both very much. I enjoy what we do. I always have, and it's a lot of work. And it makes. I know, Bill, you feel the same way. It makes it very gratifying to see people show an interest in what we talk about. So, and whether they agree with us or not, I frankly don't care. But the fact that they watch and they digest it and they hopefully enjoy it is very, very gratifying. So
cool. All right, so here we go, gents. This question comes from Ray. What did Halsey do that Gormley failed to do, and how? How could a change in command make such a difference, and why couldn't Gormley succeed in that role?
Well, that's a good one. And I know, Bill, you got a lot to say about Halsey, but we've talked about this a gazillion times. In 1942, he was the man, and that was the key. Is that Halsey was to a fault, he was a knee-jerk, action-based, punch you in the mouth guy. And I say to a fault because, of course, that's the whole Lady Golf thing. We've talked about that ad nauseum. But in 1942, he was the guy that instilled action into the United States Navy, specifically off of Guadalcanal, whereas Gormley did not. Gormley was, I would hesitate to say he was even reactive, because a lot of times he didn't even react in the proper way. Whereas Halsey was just like, all right, let's go. Let's get it done. Let's get it done right now. And then he had a reputation too, even in 42. And he comes in October 42. And he had a reputation then as a punch you in the mouth kind of guy. And when the word gets around the fleet and ashore on Guadalcanal that Bill Halsey's in command now, the morale lifted and went boop up like 5 notches. I mean, what do you think, Bill?
I agree. So there's 3 things he did that Gormley didn't do. The first thing has to do with situational awareness. Sometimes, as you know, Shawn, being an Army guy, sometimes you get the best situational awareness from the TOC, the Tactical Operations Center, the Command Center, where you could see the disposition of forces really well. But sometimes you just got to go to the front to see what's happening.
Yep.
And unlike Gormley, who stayed there in New Caledonia, Halsey went to Guadalcanal. He talked to the people who were leading from the front. So that was point number 1 thing he didn't do that Gormley did. Second thing he did that Gormley didn't do is the aggressiveness that Seth was talking about. Halsey wasn't the grand strategy guy. He could not have done what Nimitz did. But what he was he was a weapon, like Patton. You point him, and he's going to be effective. He's going to go out, and he's going to move out in that direction. You point him, and he's going to get it done. The third thing, and this sometimes works, this sometimes actually is counterintuitive, sometimes hurts, is the personality aspect of it. And that's what Seth was talking about when he said the morale just kind of lifted.
It skyrocketed, yeah.
Because they knew his personality. They loved him. He was gregarious. He was, I'm reminded of the story where he dove into the bunker when they were under attack, and he said, I was shaking like a little girl. He was honest about it. He didn't try to be somebody he wasn't, and the troops loved him for that. And kind of like Patton, they would have done anything for him, which was not true of some other people. Somebody rose, I'm not going to pile on MacArthur right now, but Montgomery in England, right? Character, I think that people would say, I'm not going to do anything for that guy because I just don't like him. People did want to do things for Halsey. Way too long. If we keep answering questions at this length, we're never going to get through 10 of them, let alone.
It's a good question, and
it is.
That's what I was thinking. What Bill took towards a very Pattonistic kind of leadership up front. Was Gormley more of a cerebral guy, Seth?
No. Gormley was a very so Nimitz usually made very, very good choices in personnel, and we all know this. And he gave people I don't want to say a lot of chances, but he certainly gave them more than one chance, and we all know the story of why, because he had second chances. Point being, Gormley was a guy that he knew, that Nimitz knew. He was also a guy that Ernie King knew. And King was, when Nimitz said, I'm going to put Gormley in charge down here, King was like, meh. But he let Nimitz do his thing. And Gormley was just out of his element, man. He was not first of all, also by the time he got relieved by Halsey, he was very sick. Like he had, I believe, Bill, wasn't it like tooth abscesses or something like that? He was bad off. Like the dude was
It
in
was a great
like really
deal of
poor
pain.
health. Yeah, he was in poor health. But regardless of that, just like Bill said, he never went to the front. He never went and laid eyes on the situation. He was, yeah, I hesitate to use the word reactive because he didn't react a lot of times when he should have. Whereas, Bill Halsey goes in there and he just immediately, literally grabs the bull by the horns and said, "All right, we're going to do this. We're going to do this my way, and we're going to use every single thing I have in my arsenal, even if I get them all sunk. We're going to, God damn it, we're going to fight." And that's what he does.
Good answer. Good answer, gents. All right, let's go to the next one. And I mixed up these. I've got a Facebook question from Brian. Why does the performance of U.S. carrier air groups seem to decline in the anti-shipping role in 1944 and 45? It seems like the level of damage done in the major carrier engagements of 44 and 45 isn't remotely commensurate with the size of the force being employed, especially in contrast to what was achieved in 42 with far smaller forces against much better opposition. I know the fast carriers were doing a lot of anti-surface work at that point in time, but that doesn't seem like a reasonable excuse when you look at the levels of training and experience the pilots had in 42 engagements and the difficulties they faced, like bomb sites icing over and flying aircraft like the TBD. Great question.
Fantastic question. And we've actually, Bill, we've talked about this before with John. And, to answer your question, and you're not going to want to hear this, I don't know, because the training of these guys was so high in 44 and 45. They had so many more hours. They had better aircraft. The only thing that Bill and I have with John have hypothesized is that they did not have the opportunity. And I said this I think it was when we did Hailstone, when we did the truck episode. They did not have the opportunity, and stupid as it sounds, but it's true, to hit moving targets. You can hit a target that's, sitting still in a harbor pretty easy, but it's hard to move a carrier that's doing this and a cruiser that's doing this. It's not easy. And I mean, I forget what was the hit rate, Bill? Less than 10%, in 42.
It was, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, it was significantly less.
Dive bombers.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think it was just a lack of practice in hitting moving targets. I really honestly do. The quality, and there's something else to be said, and we've talked about this too, is that the quality of the U.S. Navy pilots in 42, did they have as much combat time as the guys in 44? Or even stick time? Yeah, maybe. But these guys, the ones that are flying in 42, these are most of them, not all of them. Most of them are academy graduates who have been flying since like 38. These guys have got a lot of stick time. I mean, these are professionals. Not that the guys in 44, 45 weren't, but the guys in 42 had literally been training their whole lives for this moment, or these moments, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, the only thing I would add, Seth, is that, and I'm going to tell a story. Back in the Reagan buildup, when we started building submarines at an increasing rate, we needed to man these submarines. We needed crews for them. And that wasn't as easy as you would think, because, particularly training commanding officers. In those days, the joke was if you had a pulse, you were going to command, because we needed every CO we could get. And that meant that some people went to command who should not have gone to command if there was some selectivity. Remember how fast we were building aircraft carriers in the 41, 42, 40. We had to find pilots for all those aircraft carriers. So we were greatly increasing the rate at which we recruited and trained pilots for all those. So that means I hate to say it, to some extent, you've got to accept lower quality because you need bodies to man those things. And just like my early days in submarines, I almost got out of the Navy because I had some really bad COs who really turned me off to the Navy during those days. The same thing was kind of happening here, where you had less qualified pilots because we needed so many of them to man these increasing air wings and carrier crews.
Yeah, that's a good point, because I mean, you can train to the cows come home, but it's either you're good or you're not. And I mean, there were some pilots
and no skill required.
Yeah,
some things you can train, some things you can't.
And then too, and that's a really good point, Bill. And I hadn't really thought about that till you brought it up. But again, think of the pilot corps in 42. let's just say Midway, Pilot Corps Midway. Those guys, I mean, to get to that stage, you had to be the absolute best of the best. Because you're talking, most of these guys are pre-war aviators, or at the very least had joined, pre-Pearl Harbor, but had gotten their training post-Pearl Harbor. I mean, these are the cream of the crop, because even though you got your wings, if you weren't very good, they weren't putting you on a carrier. They're going to make you fly a PBY. And I'm sorry if I insulted anybody, but that's the God's honest truth. And that's a very good point. I never really thought about that until you said that, though. But they needed if you could breathe and you could fly, you were going out there.
Hey, let the record show that I thought of an answer that Seth hadn't yet.
No, that was a great. No, but it really was. That makes perfect sense, though. It makes perfect sense. But to answer nobody really knows. But I agree 100% with what Bill said, and I also believe that they did not have a lot of practice at moving targets, and that's a hell of a lot different than hitting a ship anchored in Dublin Harbor.
That's good point by Bill, because even in the war on terror, I mean, Bill, you remember 05, 06, remember the surge, the Army was trying to get as many people, they were giving out bonuses left and right just to get anybody, bodies out there. So that's a great point. All right. So let's see, Mr. Facebook, Mr. J, how much difference is the early war if the Mark 14 torpedoes work properly? So I'm going to give that to Bill. There was tons of questions on torpedoes. Bill, I'm just going to give you a couple of these. So I know that's a setup question, but was there anybody ever held accountable for this through the Ordnance Department or anything? Or that was a big overriding question that people had.
Sadly, no. And guys died because of it. And that's it. So I didn't prepare for answers to answer any of these questions except for this one, because I went back to some research I did while I was Commodore and basing it on this book called The Last Patrol. I don't know if you could see that.
Yeah, we got it.
Harold Holmes. Yeah. And so when I was Commodore, I went back to World War II and did analysis of what caused us to lose. And by the way, a little bit of this silent victory is the Bible, right, for World War II submarines. And so I went back while I was Commodore and looked at the reason of the 52 submarines that we lost in World War II. What was the cause of the loss? So I had to dust off my old notes here. And I had to revise it somewhat. And what I learned is that we lost 11 submarines that were conducting attacks during the time of the faulty torpedoes. Okay. So of the 52 boats that we lost during war, at really high levels, there's about a third of them we lost due to accidents. A few of them we lost due to friendly fire, actually 4 we lost due to friendly fire. Some we lost for unknown reasons. And then some of them, we know we're conducting attacks. And ones I can confirm were 11. So that question, so there's 2 aspects of the question, right? There's aspect number 1, how many boats might we not have lost if torpedoes worked during that approach and attack? And so the number is that I can come up with, as close as I can get, is 11. So that's 11 submarines and 11 crews, roughly estimate 70 submariners per boat that's lost. So that's, 770 human beings that were experienced submariners that might have been able to continue the fight if we hadn't lost them, if the torpedoes worked. So that's aspect number 1. The second aspect is how many boats claimed that they would have been able to sink important ships if their torpedoes worked. And I went back and the answer is Kingfish, Pompano, Tunny, Wahoo, Sculpin, and Trout. And Trout, well, Red Ramage was CO, right? He said 25% of his torpedoes actually worked. Tunny was sent after Hiyo and Junyo and actually conducted an attack on Taiyo with faulty torpedoes. So what's the impact if any of those ships might have worked, right? And we all know what Mush Morton might have done had his torpedoes worked, and other guys like that. And Pompano conducted another approach and attack on a carrier, and the torpedoes didn't explode. So there's the aspect of, so I know of at least 6 capital ships that might have been sunk in 1942 and early 43 had torpedoes worked. So that's the other aspect of the question, right? So ships that would have been sunk and may not have been able to contribute to the war, and submarines that were lost and crews lost because of faulty torpedoes. So my answer is it would have had a substantial impact on the conduct of the war if there was torpedoes. Remember, it wasn't just the Mark 14. The question asked about Mark 14s, but some of the Mark 18s that went on Wahoo, Mush Morton was so excited to get, and their exploders didn't work. So the exploders were the same in both variants of the torpedo. So it was Mark 14 and Mark 18 torpedoes we had problems with. Seth, anything?
I mean, if you think about, just what you said, the capital ships alone, if they take those suckers out, how that might change the war aspect, even the battles that we talked about in the show, there might not have been those battles to talk about because those ships might not have been there. But, I mean, if you look at the sinkings, not even just warships, you just look at cargo ships and merchant fleet, Japanese merchant fleet, which is, was always the target. And all those missed opportunities that we had in 42 and early 43 because of crappy torpedoes, how much sooner the war would have been brought to an end. Because we're going to talk about that in season 4, the operations of submarines in 44 and 45. We're going to get that into depth, Operation Strangulation. I'm not strangulation, Operation Starvation, sorry. And talk about that and talk about, that basically we were trying to blockade / starve the Japanese out. Well, accelerate that by a year. And how much sooner could we have brought the Japanese to the negotiating table if we'd have actually been able to sink what we were shooting at in 1942 and 43, early 43.
Great answer. Yeah. Great research. Bill, just a follow-up, GMAC, he's part of the Australian Army. He had a couple of quick ones, so I'm just going to fire them at you, and you can give me. What's the depth a sub needs to fire a torpedo? What depth do they have to be besides being on the surface?
Yeah, generally periscope depth, because you wanted to get final bearing and shoot. So that final bearing is really important. Otherwise, you send the torpedo off from the wrong direction. So that would be 60 feet-ish for a World War II submarine.
And then the gun, when it comes onto the surface, is that gun ready to fire, or do they have to do something to it?
Yeah, they got to take the plug out of the muzzle, and they've got to take the ammunition out of the watertight lockers that they're in. They don't have to blow them clear or anything like that. But yeah, they've got to prep them.
And finally, last question on that: what's the depth that you can survive and get to the surface if a sub's sunk, quote unquote? What is there a depth number that's like that you can safely get out? World War II.
Honestly, it depends on an individual's physiology and anatomy. So some people would be able to survive doing a free ascent from, in those days they were using moms and lungs, from let's say 200, 250 feet. Other people would get bent or air embolism. If you use proper technique, you could avoid the air embolism, but you can't avoid getting decompression sickness or the bends. So, and then you may, let's assume you do, air embolism is almost always fatal. But if you get the bends, some people can survive, other people can't. So there's not a single answer. I've done ascents from 150 feet before while doing diving, scuba diving, right? But I would not want to try it much deeper than that.
Gotcha. To stick with subs, this is for both of you. Ted asked, did the U.S. adopt the wolf packing idea from the Germans, or we had talked about in some episodes, hey, we got quote quote wolf packs, or is that something we developed on our own? Just to kind of explore that for a second for us.
Go ahead, Bill.
This is not a quick answer. Yeah, this is not a quick answer. No. Yeah, so the Wolfpack tactics that we used and the Germans used were very, very different. So first, let's talk about numbers of submarines. Over the course of the war, the German built something like 1,000 submarines to our 250. So that's point number one. So the Germans could throw a lot more submarines into Wolfpack than we could. The second point is the German Wolfpack started out in a scattered, dispersed formation, because the most difficult thing about finding that convoy that was crossing the Atlantic was locating it. And remember, that convoy might have 100 ships, but it would be in a 10-mile by 10-mile square. And so that 10-mile by 10-mile square over the expanse of the Atlantic Ocean is very, very small. So they would start out with a very dispersed formation all over the ocean. And then when somebody detected the convoy, they would call the rest of the boats in to attack it. So that's kind of the other thing I want to say about this in general is Admiral King, we talked about this a little bit, had a bad reputation of being anti-Brit. He was not. He was not an Anglophobe. He was, in fact, he served with the Royal Navy for part of his career. Before we joined the war, the Royal Navy had already established the Canadian Navy, Royal Canadian Navy, as the screening force for all of those ships we were sending to reinforce England and UK. So there was already a screen protocol established. It wasn't that he was ignoring these screens and ships in disposition. It was that he, for right or wrong, he believed that the Canadian Navy was doing a good enough job that he could devote more of his attention to the Pacific, where nobody was doing anything. So I'll divert to the Pacific now and our convoys. We really, our Wolfpacks, we did keep up to 3 submarines generally in a Wolfpack where they would do coordinated attacks. We used radio communications differently than the Germans used. By the way, the Germans' radio coordination for the Wolfpacks turns out to be their Achilles heel that caused them to lose 700 of those 1,000 submarines over the course of the war. But we used our procedures very, very different. Sometimes we had a Wolfpack commander. In fact, you'll remember one Wolfpack commander went down with his submarine because he knew too much about galvanic, right? And he'd rather allow himself to be killed than be captured. The other aspect of it is that, we didn't disperse our force because the targets were so dispersed. They didn't use convoys. The Japanese didn't use convoys the way the Allies did in the Atlantic. That it didn't make any sense to disperse our force. So we would keep our Wolfpack together. Again, that answer is way too long, Seth.
No, but it's right. And John Cromwell was the guy. I did the real-time history there. But yeah, I mean, in our Wolfpacks too, while the German Wolfpacks obviously were highly successful, ours were too. And we didn't really start employing them to that degree that Bill was referring to until really late 1944. Yeah, there were a few in between there, but really late 44, early 45. That's when our Wolfpacks were going in there, and I mean, we were just waylaying things. And again, we'll get into that this coming season. But yeah, that's a deep one, no pun intended.
Great explanation, guys. Next one, we're gonna go with another Facebook with Scott. What was the most strategically significant single ship sinking by a submarine in the Pacific theater? Shinano was large, but probably wasn't bound for much. Shikaku just had its air group annihilated and would have been relegated to decoy duty. Wasp was on the lightweight side of fleet carriers, so it was probably destined for something more significant. Technically, you could throw the Yorktown in there too. Maybe the most significant one wasn't a carrier. Is it a Tago sinking? The last straw for Corrido, for instance. So really good. I could tell you the one had the Indianapolis been sunk en route, that probably would be the easily that would answer that question. But
agree with that.
I'm gonna go ahead and take a stab at this one. Okay, so there's a 2-part answer. One, if Yorktown is not sunk, Yorktown is going to go to the yard, and she's not going to go to Pearl, or she's going to go to Pearl, but she's going to go to the United States, and she's going to be laid up in the yard for a while. A, she needed an overhaul because she hadn't had one since shortly after Pearl Harbor. B, she's got some significant damage here. She has some significant damage. So she's going to, let's just say, hypothetically, she gets to the United States on July the 1st, just pulling that out of thin air. She's going to be in the yard for a good 2 months. And I don't care, how much gas they pour, the pedal goes down. She's going to be a good 2 months, maybe 3, maybe more. because again, you got to remember after Coral Sea, her damage wasn't necessarily fully repaired. It was like, you put a Band-Aid on a chest wound kind of a thing. So, I mean, just do the math. I mean, you go July to August, September, October, November. Maybe she comes into theater end of October, beginning of November, which would obviously be a shot in the arm for the United States Navy off the coast of Guadalcanal. Having that veteran carrier back, she's not going to have the same air group. She's going to have a mixed composite air group of veterans and new guys like Enterprise does with Air Group 12, Air Group 10 off of Santa Cruz. It's going to be a mix of old and new guys. Still going to be very potent, but it's going to come towards the tail end of the Canal campaign. And I don't really think that's arguable. I mean, I don't expect to see her at Santa Cruz. I think at best, she gets there early November. So she's going to be potent, but not to the degree that WASP would have been. I'm going to make the argument, and again, we've already said this, and we'll probably get into this later. Guadalcanal is a turning point of the war. We know this, or at least we agree on this. WASP is there on August 7th. If she doesn't get sunk in September, she's playing a role at Santa Cruz, one would think. That's one more flat top full of aircraft. She's going to be around to provide more aircraft to Henderson Field, and just like Enterprise and Saratoga do. I think if WASP doesn't get sunk, obviously we win. But if WASP doesn't get sunk, I think we win a little easier. And you never know. I mean, one good hit could provide the tipping point at Santa Cruz. And I think WASP is probably, in my opinion, the most significant sinking, certainly on the United States side, pre-1945.
I 100% agree. The only other bit of enlightenment I think we probably want to add is that we did a much better job rescuing crews after ships were sunk than the Japanese did. And so, the only thing that might cause the pendulum to swing to the side of one of the Japanese ships is generally when they're sunk, those guys are gone.
Yeah.
Whereas when WASP was sunk, many of those guys were recovered, right? And so, but I 100% agree that if WASP had been there for Santa Cruz, it could have made a measurable difference. By the way, Scott, this is a great question. Scott asked the question. I do think that you can't make the same argument for any of the Japanese ships on your list. So I'm going with WASP.
I would agree.
Okay. All right, Ken in Kaiser, Oregon asks, with each battle and engagement during World War II in the Pacific, each one brought the war closer to its conclusion. At what point do you feel the Japanese high command knew or were pretty sure that they were not going to prevail? Is it Midway, Guadalcanal, Saipan, Korea's center force? Love what you guys do. I have Tuesdays, Wednesday off, and I'm up sometimes for the sun on Tuesdays, anticipation to listen to the podcast. So what do you guys, when do the Japanese think they got it figured out?
First part, get some sleep. Second of all, second, Saipan. There's no question. The Japanese high command, well, the ones who are actually cognizant of the actual way the war is unfolding, realize that not necessarily even Saipan, but that's the big one. When the Marianas fall, that's it, baby. It's Katie bar the door. It's over with after that.
It's done. Agree. They knew by Leyte, they knew that they were losing, right? Okay. So it can't be the center force. It happened before. In fact, the center force, to some extent, thought of it as a suicide mission. They even talked about that.
Right.
So it's got to be before that. And I agree. It's the Marianas, and it's got to be Saipan. Guadalcanal, they didn't think they were losing, right? They thought they were going to recover. And so that's after Midway. So, I would say it's got to be Marianas, particularly when the Turkey shoot happened, right? Yes. And so right after, now your land forces are losing. Turkey shoot means your aviation forces are losing. There's no way to recover from that.
And not just that too. Once the Marianas fall, and we've said this, the Japanese were aware that we had the B-29, or we were developing the B-29. They also had a rough idea of the range of this thing. They also knew that when the Marianas fall, it's like, we're gonna be bringing the thunder here. We're gonna be reaping the whirlwind pretty dang soon. And it does happen. I mean, the Marianas fall, and by the time everything's wrapped up, it's the end of July, August. And we start getting B-29s in there in November. So, I mean, it's pretty quick. So yeah, definitely without a doubt, Marianas. Because I mean, you got to remember, and I don't know, well, at least I think one of the questions we'll talk about is, the turning point. The Japanese were still on the offensive at Guadalcanal, or at least
Correct.
until a certain point. So yeah. Anyway.
I love the biblical allusion there too. When you sow the wind, you reap the whirlwind. Thanks for that, Seth.
Mhm.
This one is a little in depth, but I'm going to try
boy.
I'm going to streamline it for you a little bit. Okay. So Dave, his major question is, what are the top 3 negative or unnecessary actions by each side in the Second World War? So it's a really good question. He gives examples. I'm going to say, okay, you can't say Pearl Harbor, guys. Okay. You're not allowed to say that. But can you give us 3 for the Japanese and 3 for the Americans that were like, hey, we shouldn't have done that, or hey, that could have made a huge difference? And like I said, he gives examples, but I don't want to give them to you. I'd rather you guys do these off the top of your head to make it a little bit more difficult for you.
Bill, you want to start? You want me to go?
Yeah, my top 3 would be Peleliu, Peleliu, and Peleliu.
All right, next question.
All right. No. And so, yeah, from the Japanese standpoint, the question, if Pearl Harbor is the stupidest, right? If they would have just gone after the Philippines, maybe we don't enter the war when we do. Maybe we don't enter the war, until Atlantic starts looking, European theater starts looking like it's unrecoverable, and we don't have any, FDR thinks he doesn't have any choice. So I think Pearl Harbor is the biggest mistake the Japanese made. Just go after the Philippines, make it a hegemony in the Far East, and say United States won't get involved now. And they might have been right. In our case, one could make the argument to Tarawa, but I don't think we knew what we were doing yet at Tarawa. At Peleliu, we absolutely knew how to do amphibious operations, and we should have known how bloody that would have been. And that's why I think it's our biggest mistake.
Biggest mistake made by the United States in the Pacific, I would agree. Peleliu is without a doubt, but there's other ones too. And I mean, I think too that, if you look at some of the operations by MacArthur, and I'm not banging on MacArthur at all. I'm not doing that. I'm just saying some of the intelligence operations, it's not even by Mac, it's by his staff, by Willoughby in particular. Some of the intelligence operations or lack thereof by Willoughby, Brigadier General Willoughby, they cost thousands of American lives, specifically Luzon. And I know we haven't talked about Luzon yet, and we will obviously very, very soon. But, his pathetically low troop estimates of what's lying on Luzon waiting for us there, he says like 150,000 or something like that. And there's close to 280,000 guys there. He was an ass, number one. But number two, that cost thousands of lives, literally thousands of lives. And there's no arguing that. So Peleliu, number one, Charles Willoughby, number two. He's the biggest mistake. Number for the Japanese, I mean, obviously the obvious low-hanging fruit is Pearl Harbor. After that, I would have to say their lack of understanding on how to fight the United States ground forces until 1944. And not even 1944, like late 44. The fact that they did not have any kind of class in the Imperial Japanese IGHQ, that they did not have a class on how to fight the United States Army until late 44. They were still trying to figure out how to fight the Chinese. And it's like, the Chinese are not the ones whipping your ass. We are. And the fact that they completely missed that is until so late, cost them hundreds of thousands of lives. But anyway.
Two things. One is, and he throws one out, Saipan, Spruance not going after the fleet. Would you consider that a top 3 or 4 now?
I don't know, because Bill's a huge Spruance fan, and I mean the thing is with Spruance or with Phil C is that I've said I think he probably should have let Mitcher go and let Mitcher run. I really do, and I think the results would have been a little better. But again, this goes back to the question that was asked earlier: the results of American naval aviators, and why weren't they getting the results that they got in 42 and 44? Well, I mean, god dang, look at what happens the next day. And yes, admittedly, they're attacking in the evening, but we only sink one carrier. how much more damage do we do if Mitchell is allowed to run? I don't know. So,
and the other aspect of it is Spruance what he did was in compliance with the orders that Nimitz.
Yeah.
So, one, I thought about this question, Seth and Bill. I just wanted to throw out Operation Mo. That's the April offensive for the Japanese in Port Moresby, which sends the Zukaku and Shukaku to the Coral Sea. Maybe not doing that and saying, hey, we're going to consolidate for this Midway operation and having all 6 fleet carriers. And that, I thought, in my mind, that might have helped things a little bit, let's say, at the Battle of Midway.
For sure. But I mean, the Japanese were so overconfident in 1942. And I mean, truth be told, we hadn't done a dang thing to stop them. So they figured that, yeah, we can send, because, you got to remember this Zuikaku and Shokaku, and they're the B team. They're going to send the B team out there and they're going to go knock this out. And then we're going to send the big boys out there and they're going to go do this. So, anyway.
All right, let's see. Brian asks, I really enjoy the Smart episodes. I remember many of my misconceptions, I believe, when I watched Battle 360 or the History Channel episodes. The key factors of the air groups was a complete surprise. Well, I guess I need to do more reading. Here's some just basic questions. Is it true some planes had depth charges? 1, and 2, if so, could they have set a shallow depth drop in front of a vessel and the explosion caused hull damage like a torpedo going off under a ship? These are just things that keep me up at night. Thank you again. I love the format and love your shows, Brian.
So I'm going to let Bill take the depth charge damage question for obvious reasons, but I'm going to take the first part of the question. Yes, there were guys that were airborne that had depth charges as well as armament because they were on anti-submarine patrol. So the guys that are launched, that are already airborne, when they see Kurita and there's the original uh-oh moment, the oops moment that we talk about, those guys, by and large, not all of them, but by and large, were armed with depth charges because they are there to sink Japanese submarines. They are not there to attack the Yamato. They're the early planes that are launched from Taffy 3, the early Avengers that are launched, and by early I mean the first wave that is launched, as they're under fire, and even before, when Ziggy Sprague says, "Get everybody the hell off my deck," a lot of those people were also armed with depth charges, and yes, they did drop them on the Kurita center force. What damage they did, Bill?
Yeah, so right, agree. And people will recall the many, many times we talked about bomb near misses, right? Where dive bomber drops, it doesn't hit directly on the ship, but it hits in the water alongside the ship and does damage. So clearly, something that explodes close aboard can do damage. The question is, can the depth charge? When we talk about those bombs, it's generally 500-pound bombs, sometimes 1,000-pound bombs. But the depth charges don't need charges that big because they're the coupling of the pressure is aided by the depth. So if you explode something deep next to the hull of a submarine, and there's already significant pressure due to hydrostatic force of the ocean on that submarine that's deep, it doesn't take much delta pressure, change in pressure, to cause that submarine hull to fail. So the depth charge doesn't need that big of an explosion. As big, I should say, as something that's exploding shallow. So the depth charge is likely not going to do a significant amount of damage the way a bomb would if it explodes close aboard.
Cool. Great answer, guys. Moving on, we got Bill in Sherman Oaks, California. He says, is the Wildcat given short shrift today because it got more effective as we changed aerial combat tactics during the Solomon campaign? Was the Corsair significantly better than the Hellcat? Just a lot harder to land on a carrier? Thank you.
Was the Corsair better than the Hellcat or the Wildcat? I didn't.
He says, is the Wildcat given short shrift today because it got more effective as we changed aerial combat tactics during the Solomon campaign? So let's start.
Okay, I got you. So I think. Yeah, it's a two-parter. I think, yes, I think the Wildcat has given a short shrift. Was it the best aircraft of World War II? No, it wasn't. And that's very hard to rank. I mean, personally, I think in the Pacific, the Corsair is certainly the sexiest beast of them all, but the Hellcat was probably a better airplane. But that's besides the point. The Wildcat was a good airplane for its time. The big thing about the Wildcat is it was rugged. It's going to bring you home more often than not. You know, I mean, Grumman Iron Works. That's why they called them that. But it wasn't as fast. It wasn't as maneuverable, but it was flown by those masters that we were talking about in 1942. It was flown by guys like Swede Vedeza and Butch O'Hare and Jimmy Thatch, you know, people like that, guys who had been doing this for years, guys that were, you know, just literally masters of their craft. So they took the airplane. That wasn't a bad airplane by any means. It was a good airplane. And they made it even better because they were so much better at their craft. Does that make sense? Bill, I mean, would you agree?
Yeah, agree completely. Nothing to add. Perfect answer.
Oh, okay. Well, there we go.
So was the Corsair significantly better than the Hellcat?
I don't know. I mean, I haven't flown either. I can't say. All I can
get up, Seth.
All I can say is this. I can say this. You know, there's a lot of mythology about the F4U. You know, they couldn't land it on a carrier. Malarkey. One of the first American naval aviators to land an F4U on the flight deck of none other than the USS Enterprise was none other than my good friend Stanley J. Swede Vedeza. As a matter of fact, he did land the first Corsair on an American flight deck off the coast of Guadalcanal on the USS Enterprise in November 1942. That being said, there were some serious kinks that needed to be worked out of the Hellcat, out of the Corsair. And then two, you know, I mean, it's a matter of money. And the Hellcat they were pouring a lot of money into the Hellcat project. And frankly, they were making them faster. And it was a damn good airplane. Good God, look at the kill ratio, you know? I mean, and yes, the kill ratio is an arguing point because the Hellcat slaughtering people who had, you know, 40 hours of stick time in 44, 45, for sure. But it was a damn good airplane, you know? I mean, that's why it was on almost every single American flight deck, with the exception of the CVEs when they had the FM2 Wildcat. So,
fun fact: Corsair was the fastest plane in the Pacific Theater, wasn't it, Seth?
Maybe.
Fastest.
Yeah,
I think so. Yeah, the thing about the Corsair isn't that it was, I would say, significantly harder to land on a carrier. The emergency procedures had to be followed very, very carefully. It had a problem with torque. And I have a few hours flying twin engine airplanes. And if you lose an engine in a twin engine airplane, you need to get that rudder in almost immediately to offset the torque, because you're going to have, you know, asymmetric thrust from one engine. Even though the Corsair only had one engine, it had a lot of torque. And, you know, if you put the power on really quickly because you're below glide slope or something like that, and you didn't get that rudder in to counteract the torque, you were going to hit the back end of the aircraft carrier. So, I mean, that was the problem. If you're flying it properly, I don't think people had a harder time landing it. It was because it had so much power, if you screwed it up, it was much harder to recover from. Much like the F-14 Tomcat, right, versus the F-18, because the engines were so far further apart than the F-18, it caused asymmetric thrust and gave a lot of pilots trouble when the casualties occurred.
There's a reason that they called the Corsair the Ensign Eliminator and the Widowmaker. There's a reason for that. So,
all right. Here's the easy one. Jay from Facebook. Do you think Nimitz should have sacked Halsey after needlessly chased Ozawa, leaving Sprague to face Kurita?
Bill.
Bill, this is all you, buddy.
So no. And so this may surprise you. My answer may surprise you. I don't think he should have sacked him for needlessly chasing Ozawa. I think he should have sacked him for loss of situational awareness as for where, you know, the CTF-34 was, and where his battleships were, and failure to leave them behind. So it's a nuance, but it's an important nuance. And if he didn't fire him then, he should have fired him after the hurricanes we're going to talk about next season. So there were several times when Nimitz should have fired Halsey. Needlessly chasing the carriers, in my opinion, isn't one of them.
I don't think he needlessly chased the carriers. The carriers are there. They're a target. Mm-hmm. He's going to sink the carriers. And he should have sunk the carriers, which he obviously does. I think it was poor judgment. And we've talked about that 4 episodes worth already. I agree with you 100%. If Bill Halsey, number one, Bill Halsey was never going to be fired. Why? Because Bill Halsey was the Navy's version of Douglas MacArthur. And I don't mean that in a negative way to Bill Halsey. So Bill Halsey was on the newspapers across the country and on Time Magazine, just like Mac.
Time Magazine.
He was not going to get fired. He was going to stay around no matter what, because he was a darling of the press and the American public. I don't care what anybody's like, no, that shouldn't have been. Well, that's the way it was, and that's the way it was going to be. Might he have been shuffled off to some other command? Possibly, but I agree with you 100%. He was completely at fault for the typhoons, hurricanes, whatever you want to call them. And we will get into both of those things. The first one, he could maybe you could maybe get him a little leeway. The second one, it's like, no, dude, it's literally the exact same situation that you just got berated for by Ernie King and Chet Nimitz, and you did the same damn thing. So yeah, you kind of screwed this up. And Admiral King himself even said after the war, I don't have a problem with Bill Halsey, and I'm paraphrasing. I don't have a problem with Bill Halsey in Leyte Gulf, or he said the great battle. I have a problem with 2 typhoons.
Good answer, guys. So this is from Jim from New York City. It's a kind of a hypothetical, so just get ready. Hi, guys. Think the world of you all. So John has stated in lectures that even if we lost the Battle of Midway, we still would have won the war. Had we lost that battle and 3 of our carriers are at the bottom of the Pacific, then Japan probably would have shelled the west coast of the U.S. and Hawaii, and that would force the U.S. to come to terms with them, and the Pacific Ocean map would look much different. And we also wouldn't have a crucial ally in Japan right now. I would say I agree with 99.9% of what he says, but I'm just curious on Seth and John's view. But thank God for our vets and for guys like you tell the stories. So I'm going to, it's funny because Seth and we've talked about this on more than one occasion. So I think, Seth maintains, and I'm not talk for, he said once that the turning point of the war was when Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. That come hell or high water, we were gonna win that war. Yep. So what I'd like for you guys to do with that is tell us, in that universe, let's just say hypothetically, let's just say the Japanese invade Oahu on 41. Give us just what that world looks like, to go down this path for just a few minutes.
Ooh. All right, so Bill, I'm gonna take the ball on this one and run. All right, so let's say Pearl Harbor's attacked December 7, 41. Japan next day lands troops. Obviously they didn't have any troops in that force. So I mean, we're living in a parallel universe, and they do put people ashore. Do they put enough people ashore to take Oahu? I don't know. I don't know how many people they got in there. Who knows? Probably not. I don't think they do. I don't think they wind up taking Oahu, frankly, because of the sheer amount of human beings we have there. Number 2, the Japanese, yes, they did shell parts of the California coast, I think twice. Once the Goleta oil fields, and there was another time, I believe, but I don't recall exactly the time or place.
Oregon.
Okay. But, are they going to parade the, IJN battle line up and down the coast of California? Not a chance in hell. Why? Because they were absolutely terrified of our land-based aircraft in 1942 and 43, and they were. And if you look at that's why do you think they continued to pound Henderson Field off Guadalcanal? Because they were absolutely terrified of our land-based aircraft. So they were never going to attack the American West Coast with any kind of major force ever. Not in that way. That was never their intention. The Man in the High Castle is a fictional story. They never would have invaded the United States West Coast, ever. Never, because they never could have won. Never in a million years. To the original point of the question, if we lose Midway and we lose Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet, which we obviously lose Yorktown, how does that, position us for the rest of the war? It puts us in a freaking tight spot, because that leaves us with Saratoga and Wasp. Saratoga's in the yard. Wasp is on the East Coast, I think. Yeah, she's not in the Pacific yet. And friggin' Ranger, which was a scow, and she's never going to come to the Pacific. Although if you have to, you have to. We lose 3 frontline carriers at Midway. Yeah, that's a pain in the ass. That's a significant problem. Do we launch Guadalcanal in July of 42? I mean, in August of 42? Of course not. Of course not. The war does look significantly different. And I know you're going to sit there and say, well, then the Midway was the turning point. No, it was not, because at the end of the day, we're not doing hypotheticals. We win. And the Japanese still are on the offensive at Guadalcanal. Every single surface fight we have, and including the carrier battles at Guadalcanal, are us responding to Japanese offensive movements. So if Midway is the turning point, then how can they still be an offensive Navy and really have us on the ropes until November 1942 in the shores of Guadalcanal? So that's my long kind of roundabout answer, if you will. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's my story, and I'm sticking to it. Bill, what about you?
I'll play the part of John right now. I think the three things that win the war for us is, number one, we had war gamed it so many times, we kind of knew the strategic moves, War Plan Orange and all of that. Which is the exact opposite of what Seth said about the Japanese Army, where they didn't war with the United States. They thought banzai charges would beat us, and they didn't. So that's the better strategy. The second thing is, the quality of our fighting men, was just, it surprised them. I think they didn't think we were as good as we were. And while what would have happened if we'd lost at Midway was the quality of those fighting men would have caused delays in causing us to delay. The war would have been extended until the third advantage which we had was we won the war in the shipyards of the United States, right? And the aviation construction facilities, where we could way outbuild the Japanese. So eventually we get back to where we needed to be to overwhelm. Would it have ended in 45? No. Mm-hmm. It would have won. It might have been 47, 48. But as long as our fighting men kept us in the fight, and as a delaying action, we would have eventually caught up and succeeded.
I agree 100% with that answer, and your position, Bill, because again, we said this not long ago, and I forget what episode we were talking about. Look at when the carriers that reached the Pacific in 43, look at when they were laid down, 41, 40, 42. We were building these suckers. Same thing with the battle wagons, Alabama, Massachusetts, Indiana. The Iowa's a little bit different, but yeah, they were all laid down, or at the very least paid for pre-war. So we're going to build these suckers, and they're coming out. They might not come out. I mean, they're going to come out at the same time, and they might not, go from the United States straight to Pearl Harbor. They may go from the United States to San Diego, where we launch. But I mean, whatever. We're coming. We're going to come. It's just going to take a little bit longer.
Yeah, I think to kind of circle back, and you correct me if I'm wrong, but Pearl Harbor after Midway is basically a fortress that we've built there, right? Yeah. We have, your best chance for success is to invade Hawaii December 7th, 19. Like that's your optimal universe. Everything's going right. And even with that in place, we can start putting shipyards in the Gulf and the East Coast.
And we do.
We're going to build the fleet, whether it's on the West Coast or the East Coast or the Gulf. So it's coming. It's just a matter of if and when.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Let's see. No, this is from Scott. When I hear of various achievements in the war that focus on the number of victories, for example, in the air, I wonder if it's just the number isn't a true barometer of the rating of these incredible achievements. Thinking of air victories is shooting down 5 Zeros in 42 with an F-4F Wildcat, the same as shooting down 5 Dow bombers from an F-6F Hellcat in 44. Other than the number, these achievements don't seem to be the same considering the circumstances of 1942 to 1944. Though the factors leading up to these events is bewildering, is there a consideration given to evaluating these outstanding achievements by our courageous forebears based on the factors other than just the victory count? Great question, Scott.
That is a good one. So I think you kind of answered your own question in your question, and that, shooting down 5 Vals or whatever it was, Kates or whatever the case may be, in 1942 in a Wildcat, it does carry more weight than shooting down 5 Judys in 1944 in a Hellcat. Why? Because A, the forces were smaller in 42. B, there was a hell of a lot more on the line in 42 than there was in 44. So you shoot down a flight of 5, whatever, off the coast of Guadalcanal, you might win the day with that 5 kill run. Whereas if you do that in 1944, you're just a hot stick. Honest to God. I mean, it's true.
Join the club.
Yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. Yeah,
the
welcome to the
quality
club.
and the quality of Japanese pilots were better in 42 than they were in 44 because all the
that's
good
the
ones had
point.
been killed. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and it's an excellent question because I did some research on this one because I was fascinated. Seth and I had a conversation on Bong's kills 40 compared to European P-51 fighters, and what they're going up against, right? Is going up against a Zero as good as going up against the Focke-Wulf and a 109. That's a whole nother, like, what does your opponent look like? How fast are you getting the kills? There's been books written on, Marseille, German fighter ace, he'd come back with 80% of his ammo, and Hartmann, who's the number one fighter ace of all time, it would, he wasn't as effective as killing his opponent. So there's so many different factors involved. It's a great question because you could write a book or a dissertation on any of those angles of who is the actual Top Gun, fighter pilot. So yeah. I love the question. What were the naming protocols for Japanese warships? Did the Japanese seriously consider assassinating Admiral Nimitz as we did Admiral Yamamoto? That's Joe from Minnesota. So first question is protocols for Japanese warships. Seth, do you have any idea on how they came up with those?
I don't have a friggin' clue.
Start with that. Good job, Joe.
I have no idea. Honest to God, who would know? It is not here. John would know, and I have no earthly clue. I do know that. I do know that a lot of the battleships, because they thought the battleship was the queen of the seas, were named after different provinces in Japan. I know that much. And then like the carriers were named like auspicious crane, translated to English, in these very, very Japanese, I don't know, flowery names or whatever, where, we got Yorktown, so, I mean, I don't know. Answer the question. I don't have a earthly idea aside from what I just said. What was the second part?
Is the Japanese ever considering assassinating Admiral Nimitz?
Bill, you and I've talked about this before, and I don't remember what the heck it was we said.
Yeah. We said they would have if they had the opportunity.
That's right. Yeah.
If they had the opportunity. He has another follow-up question. What was the value of the Marine radar unit on Guadalcanal to the air defense of that island in 42, Seth? That's pretty critical. Was there a radar station that the Marines had on Guadalcanal?
Absolutely. It wasn't always manned by Marines either, but yeah, no, they had several radar stations and radar sets on or near Henderson Field. Again, Dave Holland ain't here to answer. He could tell you exact foot of space that thing was located on. I've been there, mate. Dave, if you're watching
this. And there's a Holiday Inn there now or something like that.
God love Dave. God love Dave. But I mean, heck yeah. Because I mean, these things are detecting these inbound Japanese aircraft. I mean, I think, Bill, when you and I did the Cactus Air Force episode, we talked about, the Air Force, the radar is working, yes, but we also had combat air patrol over Cactus, over Henderson Field, over the island of Guadalcanal, or even, way out in the distance to intercept daily Tokyo time is what they called it, So yeah, I mean, there was radar there. It was critical to getting our people up in the air to shoot these guys down before they came in here.
Awesome. All right, this one, and we kind of alluded to it before. Simon asks, is Admiral King's blind spot was his negative attitude towards the Royal Navy?
Bill.
Under these circumstances, how did the HMS Victorious call sign USS Robin the function of the U.S. Navy Pacific Fleet in 43? So he's basically asking, hey, does he have a blind spot? And you guys can elaborate a little bit on what did the Royal Navy do in the Pacific?
We've been asked a few times to do an episode on that, as the British Pacific Fleet, or BPF. It's a worthwhile topic. And, as I said, Admiral King really didn't. He had a negative attitude towards everybody. He didn't. He didn't specialize in hating the Brits. He hated everybody, right?
He was
including his own people. Yeah. So again, on my Royal Navy friends, I wish they would stop saying that he did. But the interesting story about HMS Victorious, we haven't talked about it. it's really a fascinating story, is he asked the Royal Navy to provide a carrier for the Pacific because, frankly, they weren't all that useful. In the Atlantic, we had a lot of land-based aircraft, and we were really running out of aircraft carriers in the Pacific. So they bring HMS Victorious around, and they don't just give it the call sign of USS Robin. They make it look like an American aircraft carrier and the air wing as well. And they were fully integrated. Seth, you probably can jump in here and rescue me on this one.
Well, no, we should do something about that. And we full 100% clarity, we are going to do something on the BPF in 45, because that's when they really actually do show up in large, well, somewhat large numbers. But at that time that you're referring to, yeah, I mean, we needed all the help we can get or we could get. And because of the fact that Guadalcanal, the meat grinder, had winnowed down everybody's forces, including our own, to such an extent that we needed the help from the Brits, and they did come in and they did a fine job. That being said, when they come in 45, we don't need them. And Admiral King, and I think this might be part of where some of this animosity comes from, is King did not want the British Pacific Fleet in the Pacific in 1945. And he felt, and this is 100% true, he felt like, A, we got this. B, you're coming in late in the game and you want a piece of the pie. He felt that all they wanted back was Singapore, and this is true. And he wanted to keep the British out of it, mainly because of the fact that he was worried about logistics. Everybody wants to talk about logistics. King was worried about the logistics, and he's 100% right. They use different airplanes. They use different ammunition. And I mean, it's all kinds of different.
Underway replenishment wasn't rehearsed with them. Yep.
Yeah, that's another thing.
So they needed to pull port to get it replenished. Yeah, there are a lot of operational, what we call interoperability in the military, factors that were going to become problems for Admiral Nimitz with the British there. Go ahead.
To that point, when Sir Bruce Fraser comes into the Pacific and he meets with Nimitz for the first time, he and Nimitz are talking, and Nimitz asks him the question. He says, how long do you think your fleet can operate at sea? How long can you stay out? And Fraser says 28 days. And Nimitz goes, that's not going to work.
Yeah, you can't get anywhere in 28 days.
Where the hell are you going to go? At this time, you've got the big blue fleet. They're going out there and they ain't coming home. They're staying at sea 95% of the time. So he's like, nah, this is not going to work. Completely different doctrine, completely different logistical setup. So it was, obviously we integrate them into the war in 45, but it's a tight fit, shall we say. Yeah.
That's why we call the Atlantic the pond, because compared to the Pacific, right, it is small. It is a pond. So yeah, it's a worthwhile subject. And I worked with Royal Navy and I was in Hong Kong for the handover between the United Kingdom and China. I was there for that momentous event in 1997. I've got great attachment to the Royal Navy. So we ought to talk about it.
All right. From Tom in Wisconsin, love your series. I had a tour of the USS New Jersey a few years ago. Awesome. My question is, who would win this duel? The USS New Jersey in Wisconsin versus the Yamato and the Musashi?
US all the way. Why? Fire control radar.
Yep. The fire director. Yeah, the big bullet doesn't count if it doesn't hit you. And a smaller bullet, 16-inch ain't small, by the way.
Right.
Yeah. Right. It'll do damage if it hits you. And it's the director that does that.
There you go. Bob asked, during World War II, the U.S. Navy learned from its mistakes throughout the war and took steps to fix problems, areas of weakness that were uncovered. The IJN, on the other hand, seemed to make the same mistakes over and over again throughout the war. In its efforts to fix problems they did identify were haphazard. Why was that? Was it a social issue, institutional structure, or the IJN, or some other factors?
Bill, I'm going to let you lead off on the U.S. Navy side, because yes, we learned from our mistakes, but it took a while.
Yeah, a combination of the above, I would say. And by the way, we were not perfect. Remember, we talked about how long it took for us to make it known that the long lance torpedo existed and what its capabilities were. So we were not perfect, but we did have a process to fold, to capture lessons learned, do after action reports, and then fold those back into the training pipeline for people coming on the scene. And we modified our tactics over the course of the war as we learned what worked and what didn't. And the Japanese generally didn't do that. And on the Japanese side, Seth will answer, but I do say there's a cultural aspect to it. You'll remember a few years ago, a Korean Airlines airplane crashed into the end of the runway at SFO, San Francisco Airport. And I've flown into their airport, my little plane, a few times. And when they did the, how did this happen aspect of it, the co-pilot knew they were below glide slope, but culturally was not going to correct his boss, the pilot. It wasn't done. And they needed to learn how to do that. I think I've known of several instances with the Imperial Japanese Navy where these kinds of things happen. Seth?
100%. No, you're 100% right. And kind of to pile on what you were talking about the U.S. Navy, kind of like, not unlike submarine skippers, Bill, and then we can relate to this equally. Is you got these early war guys that aren't aggressive. They're sticking by the pre-war code, the pre-war books, the pre-war rules. Same thing for the SWOs. Same thing for the surface warfare officers. They're using these early war, pre-war tactics that just do not work. And you got radar. You're not using radar. Or you're not using it properly. And then you get guys who come in and they believe in the new technology. They believe in, hey, you know what? We don't have to go by the book. Let's just go with what works. Willis Lee, Arleigh Burke, Fred Moosebrugger, people like that, Norman Scott, even to a degree. And I mean, you got guys that come in there and they're like, you know what, this doesn't work. We're going to do this. And then they find out it does work. And then, of course, we rewrite the book. To the Japanese side, 100% agree. Japanese were, the IJN was no different than the USN in that they were dominated by the battleship admirals. So they're going to dominate, every aspect of thinking, and that everything has to be won by the big gun. It has to be won by the guns. And truth be told, everything they had done until November 14th, when Lee comes down there into Washington, had worked marvelously. So it's not like they were, had a losing average. They got a winning record here. They're going to the playoffs. They're doing good things. And we just start to adapt and they don't. Why don't they? Because again, a lot of the things that happen where they get defeated, some of them are circumstantial, I mean, some of them just like it's bad luck. They're in the wrong place at the wrong time kind of stuff. And it wasn't until, Bill, we've talked about all those little destroyer battles and cruiser battles in the Solomons in 43. It wasn't until then when they realized, but even then, by then, a lot of their ships had been sunk, had been heavily damaged during the Guadalcanal campaign. So, a lot of the tactics that they may have wanted to employ, they couldn't because they didn't have the ships and the people.
And then in BOP, they started to hit this from the land aspect. They started building defense. Yeah. They do learn somewhat that they start implementing in later island chains. So there is some level of, hey, we got to defend these islands a separate way. But wasn't there like they didn't even offer like a course to like 44 or something on how to America or something like that, right?
Yeah, that's what we were saying earlier, is that the Imperial Japanese Army did not have a leadership course or whatever you want to call it on how to fight the United States Army until 1944.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right, let's see. Chuck asks, during several episodes, I remember comments and speculation as to why Yamato did not send the Yamato to bombard Guadalcanal. On another channel, it was said that there was a shortage of 18-inch bombardment shells as one of the reasons. Do you know if this is true? Was Yamato ever used for shore bombardment? Great job, guys. Really enjoyed the show. Seth will remember me as the guy who said he married up. This is Chuck.
Okay. I'll answer the first part because I remember that comment on Facebook when I posted the picture, Bill, that we took at the World War II conference.
And yeah,
we all married up. Bill married up. I married up. Yeah. John Marshall married up. I mean, let's be real. To that end, not to that end, Yamato, it was recently discovered, and I forget by who. John told me, and we, again, this was one of our pre-recording. Hell, we got air the pre-show recordings and have 10 episodes on that. There was a shortage of ammunition for the 18.1s, and I forget which exact specific type, because type 3, I think it was the shore bombardment shells, and there was a shortage of those for Yamato Musashi, yes. But one of the main reasons they weren't sent to Iron Bottom, well, two main reasons. One is that there wasn't enough fuel. There were fuel hogs. And then two, and John said this 1,000 times, look at the map. Look how small that place is. Can you imagine maneuvering Yamato and Musashi in a bathtub? So I mean, I think it's a multiple thing. Bill, what about you? What do you think?
Yeah, I agree. I have nothing to add there.
But you did marry up. I've met your
Yeah,
wife.
I agree. I said, I agree. 100%.
Smart man, just be quiet and agree with that one.
Yeah.
All right.
Yeah.
Jack asks, so you've talked at length about the IGN and the shortage of trained pilots as the war dragged on. What I've never heard anyone explain in any significant detail is why they never ramped up their pilot training program before it was far too late.
I think they did. I think they did. I just think we were killing them. I hate to say it this way, as fast as they were training them. And by the way, the number of aircraft carriers was going down, not up. And so there were fewer decks to put them on. There's more impact of the land-based aviation. But those guys weren't surviving any longer than the carrier-based guys were.
Yeah. I agree. I agree. You're right. You're certainly not wrong. I think part of it is too, again, institutional. You go back to the way that they looked at the way the war was going to play out in their minds. These guys that are flying 41, 42, and even to some extent, 1943, they were the best pilots in the world. I'm sorry. They were. Japanese, specifically Japanese naval aviators, were the best pilots in the world. If you go back and you look at their training regimen and how these people were selected and how many hours they flew pre-war, there was simply not enough time to train these guys in the way that they had trained these 41, 42, early 43 pilots. There just wasn't. You got to get them out. And again, this goes back to your answer, Bill. One of the earlier questions is why the anti-shipping roles of the United States Navy kind of decreased in 44, 45. You got to pump these people out. And also to your point regarding aircraft carriers and the amount of deck space, I mean, they're building carriers in 43, 44, and 45, but you got to have fuel to operate these damn things and to train your pilots on aircraft carrier decks. And guess what? Our submarines, Bill, are sinking all your freaking tankers. So you don't have fuel to operate them.
Yeah, I think fuel, because I've seen some of the hours for 45, and the pilots they get like 10 hours before they go on kamikaze missions because there's just not enough fuel to get pilots ready.
Well,
so
you only need to train on how to
I think the thing that the invention or the technology improvement that might have hurt us the worst is if those great pilots early in the war had self-healing fuel tanks. They didn't explode when they got shot, and a lot of their pilots would have survived.
I agree with that.
Ours did, even with the Wildcat. So,
well, the thing with the Zero too, of course, is the reason, one of the reasons that it was so dang maneuverable and so dang fast is because it was light. It was light as a feather, and because it was didn't really have any armor to speak of, unlike the F-4F Grumman Ironworks Wildcat. They had the big armor plating in the back. To your point, Bill, self-sealing fuel tanks. How many lives did those things save? Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds in 1942.
All right, so Rusty has a great question that's right up both of your alleys. My question has to do with all the research done by Submersible during the last 10 years. I think you guys are maybe familiar with that, what's been going on with that. Just a little bit. A lot of ships have now been viewed at the bottom of the ocean floor, both on Japanese side and the United States. How has the video evidence of these shipwrecks altered our historical understanding of what happened in any of the naval battles fought in the Second World War? Looking forward to hearing from you. That's a great question for you two.
Bill, go for it.
We did 8 episodes of the lost ships of World War II exactly to unpack that.
Go check it out. Next question.
It's Fox Nation. Yeah, it's Obviously, we were able to confirm with the Indianapolis wreck, for example, I'll go that one first, that it was hit by 2 torpedoes, not 3, and not as my old acquaintance, I couldn't call him a friend, Edward Beach declared, it wasn't hit by a Kaizen. It was hit by 2 torpedoes. So we verified what both crews had already told us in that regard. That's one ship. But heck, all the other ships that we've done videos of. Seth?
Yeah. I mean, Tony Tully was talking about Fuso at Sir Giles Strait, and that it, for years and years and years, it was said that the bow broke off and all this other stuff. And of course, now we see it under the water, and it ain't. And that, certain ships went kaboom, and they didn't go kaboom because they're still in one piece, or at the very least 2 at the bottom of the ocean, or that this destroyer fire. And I'm blanking on the names right now. This destroyer fired its torpedoes at the American fleet. Well, no, it didn't, because the wreck found with its torpedoes, or vice versa, it didn't find their torpedoes. Kirishima, Washington and Kirishima. Washington only hit Kirishima 9 times. No, she didn't. She hit her like 21, 22 times. Why? Because there's, multiple holes in her hull. So, and they didn't, nobody chewed through the hull, so those were made by 16-inch shells. So, I mean, there's all kinds of different ones. USS Hornet, Hornet, we said this before, death by 1,000 cuts. These things were, I'm not trying to be funny, harder than woodpecker lips. I mean, it's true. They were, they took a beating, and kind of like the Timex watch. But I mean, there's a lot of understanding you could make by looking at these forensic underwater archaeology videos, photos, and everything else. And good God, yeah, we could go into each ship that Petrel found and have an episode on that alone, but we can't use the footage because Kirk Wolfinger has it. And I'm sure we could get it, but we're not going to do that. Kirk's got plans. But that being said, if you want to subscribe to Fox Nation and look at the show, we get into a lot of that there.
Yep.
Cool. Tony asks, was the West Virginia's performance Sargo Strait the best battleship gunnery in ship-to-ship combat? She hit at 22,800 yards. Scharnhorst and Warspite hit at longer ranges, though. But however, West Virginia first salvo at that range hit. It was at night, higher difficulty across multiple salvos. Again, unique for that range. So just comment on the West Virginia hitting target first time at night.
Oof. I don't know. I don't, Bill. I mean, it's hard to say what's the best shot. I mean, that's, I don't know. I mean, Weavy certainly had, we talked about this. She had Mark 8 fire control. She had, a highly trained crew, albeit new crew, but it was a highly trained crew. Frankly, it's just a matter, I mean, it's like anything else. It's a matter of luck, Yeah, I mean, you got the good radar, and you got, a good crew, and you got a good weapon, 16-inch 45s. Yeah, they're going to put a licking on something if it hits. But I mean, same could be said for Washington. I mean, the first salvo against Kirishima initially was thought to be a miss, but as we know, thanks to underwater archaeology, that was Admiral Lee's answer to the long lance. 16-inch caliber 45 rifles. This is the answer to the long lance. I'm going to punch holes in your hull underwater. So I don't know. I have no idea. Can't answer. Bill.
I don't think Scharnhorst and Warspite hit at longer range at night, though, right?
He said it.
Yeah. The difference is the radar, and our willingness. Some Americans' willingness to trust the radar, the quality of the director, Mark 8, and the fact that we trained with it and trusted it. I think that made the difference.
All right. So Mr. Sean from Long Island, New York asks, hello, I hope you're all well. My question for you is about the night battle off Guadalcanal on November 13th, 1942. I've heard it said by a number of websites and YouTubers that Admiral Abe's decision to abort the bombardment effectively doomed High A. Is this really the case? Could he realistically have continued the mission? And was there a way to save the High A? I love the podcast. Listen every Tuesday in my work truck. Sincerely, again, Sean. So what's your thoughts on that, Seth?
No way. No, Hiei was done for. Hiei was done for. She was done for. Abe, his decision to abandon the bombardment that night had, no bearing on the survivability of the ship. That thing was, she was goner. She had taken, that close quarters, absolute pounding from American cruisers. And, we've made this discussion. We've had this discussion numerous times that, that's probably why Callahan goes in as close as he does, because he knows he can't penetrate that belt armor. He knows there's battleships coming. And he's fully aware. He tells everybody, he's like, yeah, it's not going to end well for us. And that's why he gets in as close as he does to see he can punch through that armor. Hiei was a gunner. She was leaking oil. She was slowly foundering, in the morning, by the morning. And then as the sun rises, so do the aircraft from Henderson Field, which of course is ironic because that's what they're going down there to shoot. And then the Japanese are killed by the thing that they're trying to kill, which of course are aircraft from Henderson Field and Enterprise. So, Bill, what do you think?
I agree. Nothing to add.
All right, this one's for Bill then. Scott asks, how did Admiral Nimitz control his command considering the large expanse of the Pacific theater? So I think what Scott's trying to do is understand command and control in the 1940s of all these moving parts. How did that, of course, it's different when you were in, Bill, but back then, what besides having some maps up in Hawaii, what other methods are they using to kind of get these messages out and the movement of man and material, so to speak, across the Pacific?
There are layers upon layers upon layers of command and control. And at the highest level, one of these things that we talk about in the modern military all the time, Nimitz had to make sure that people understood what we refer to as commander's intent. That is almost oftentimes the most important thing, because you're always going to lose communications at the worst possible moment. It's an outcome of Murphy's Law. So you have to make sure that your subordinate commanders understand what your overarching intent is, so that if they do lose communications for mechanical or atmospheric reasons, or battle damage or whatever, they know without being told what they're supposed to do. Now, this gets to the issue of Spruance and whether he should have gone after the carriers during the Battle of the Philippine Sea and all of this. He understood Nimitz's commander's intent. And the commander's intent in that operation was protect the troops landing on Saipan. That was the number one priority, and that's why he did what he did. There were other times when commander's intent was not communicated effectively, and the battle was not lost, it was made much more painful. And so we pound that into our commanders in the military these days. At the secondary and tertiary levels, there have to be very precise, specific, tactical instructions given on a message-by-message, ship-by-ship basis. Some of those were done by telegraph messages, which is very, as you can imagine, teletype. It's going to take a long time to get those out. If you're close enough, those messages are relayed by TBS, or talk between ships, orally, right, with a radio. But it's at each level, more granularity has to be produced. At the Nimitz level, it has to be very general. If you're doing it right, and give your subordinate commanders the freedom to operate in ways that are consistent with the overall strategy, and not micromanage them, because you will never have sufficient communications to enable micromanagement in a successful fashion. I think that's kind of gets to the answer they're looking for.
A whole lot better than I could have done.
Yeah, I would say, just to kind of caveat on that is, in the Army, it was the most important thing was what's the commander's intent. Like, and every soldier knows from the top to the bottom, like, this is what I'm trying to accomplish today. So everybody knows it, regardless of what happens with communications, or if we get separated or the fog of battle, like, this is what I'm trying to get accomplished. So, but great explanation. Why did Bruno Gatto not get a medal, particularly the MOH? His bravery was on display. His action saved the Enterprise from at very least serious damage, and he yet no medal for what was an action over and above the call of duty. This is from Steve from Melbourne, Australia.
Okay. Bruno Gatto was an incredibly brave human being, a friend of mine whom I knew very, very well. We talked about him numerous times, Captain Norman J. Dusty Cleese. Dusty Cleese, none other than Dusty Cleese, considered Bruno Gaido the bravest man he ever knew. And this was before he did the action that the gentleman, what's his name again? The question?
Steve.
Steve. The question that Steve's referring to, of course, is when Gaido gets in the rear seat of the SBD and shoots down or helps shoot down the incoming Japanese aircraft on the February 1st Marshall Islands raid. Why didn't he get that medal? I don't know. Guys certainly got that medal for doing less things. MacArthur. He
can't help yourself. You can't help
couldn't.
Bro.
I saw Bill smile. I know you like that one. But I mean, in all honesty, why didn't he? I have no idea. Probably because he wasn't recommended for it. But I mean, did he deserve it? Honestly, did he deserve it? I would. He does get promoted, yeah. But does he deserve it? You know, honestly, I'd have to say probably not, because his job was an aviation. I forget, it was either aviation ordnanceman or radioman. Regardless, he's a rear seat gunner. His job is to do that. He's doing his job. And then, of course, the case could be made, well, you know, you got an infantryman doing his job when he gets a Medal of Honor. Yeah, well, it's a little bit different when you take the initiative and you charge a Japanese pillbox and wipe out 5 of them and kill 50 guys. You know, I mean, I understand where the question's coming from. I do. And I don't necessarily disagree. I'm just saying he didn't get it because there's no record of him being recommended for it. And also, Bill, we've talked about this too. Those early war events, you know, there's not a lot of ribbons being handed out, whether they be blue ribbons or not. The first real big medal handout is Midway, when every pilot gets a Navy Cross and every, you know, enlisted man gets a DFC. But that's you know, it. I mean, look at the actions that happened in 42. There's not a lot of blue ribbons being handed out until really the Guadalcanal campaign.
Yeah, I would say there's a couple of factors at play here. The first one is the brevity of the action of his, you know, it was only a few minutes, I think, where he was manning that gun. It wasn't like, yeah, it wasn't like the guy who's, you know, under fire for, you know, 2.5 hours and, you know, takes out 4 pillboxes. And so that's point number one. Point number two is early in the war, and the standard had not yet been established. And point number three, and I hate to say this, but my service in particular was pretty unfair when it came to enlisted men awards. And I'm talking about the Navy. You know, Marines were getting medals of honor, obviously fairly early in the war, but not so much Navy enlisted. So that was an issue. And 4, it's very subjective. There is no, you know, ruler you can take out and hold against an action and say this one deserves and this one doesn't. It was, for the most part, it was done based on precedent, and nothing like this had ever happened before. So there was no precedent with which to measure what he had done. So I guess those were factors at play. As far as whether he deserved it or not, I'd have to really look at it much more carefully than I have to render an opinion on that.
Yeah, I think you guys highlight some good points. During this past war that, you know, Bill and I fought in, there was a big, almost medal protectors protecting the Medal of Honor. Actually, the Medal of Honor Society had to come out and say, "Hey, stop! Like there are men that have earned this. Like, let's go do a in-depth analysis of some of these. You're trying to protect the award." So I think that's a great point.
The standard. Yeah, you've raised the standard too much, right? And the Civil War was the only medal that existed. So thousands of medals of honor were handed out that would never have been handed out 30, 40, 50 years later. In World War II, I think they got the standard about right. Today, I think they got the standard is too restrictive. And I think there are many. Heck, I fought for a Navy Cross once when I was on active duty for somebody that it had been written up as a Bronze Star, and I pulled out precedent after precedent after precedent, saying no, this is at least a Navy Cross, and it was awarded. But it was like, this is crazy,
right? And there is one major criteria. The Medal of Honor has a couple of, but one of them is you can't be ordered to do it. It has to be on your own volition. So that's why
That's
I
right.
think the
And
question
he
is
wasn't.
like he kind of does it
Yeah.
on his own volition. So you can kind of say, okay, he is protecting the ship. It is his own volition. So I get where the question comes from, but it definitely demands a look at, you know, in my opinion, of me and Bill having written awards.
Mm.
Let's see. Sam from Facebook, can you go into detail how a ship was returned to service after being damaged in battle? Specifically, the process from temporary repairs in the Pacific all the way reaching the main shipyard. Also, were the crews of a heavily damaged ship transferred to other postings? Actually, that's a really good question. Seth, can you just give us a 50,000 foot, like, how does that process work?
I'm gonna throw this to Bill for obvious reasons, but I will say this: a heavily damaged ship's crew, when they went back to the United States, and again, this is more Bill's area than mine. They got leave, you know, at least the vast majority of them did, and some of them were assigned to different places for various reasons. The one thing that I can think of where heavily damaged ships' crews were essentially, by and large, transferred out to different areas, different ships, is after Pearl Harbor, because all these battleships, they got these, you know, 1,000+ man crews, they got nowhere to go, and the Navy needed men to do different things. The United States, USS California's band was not put, you know, in Station Hypo because they were attuned to music. That's a myth. That's a bunch of baloney. They were put there because they needed people breathing to operate those machines. It had nothing to do with that myth that's out there. But Bill can riff on this far better than I.
Yeah, I mean, we'll use the Indianapolis as an example. It starts with the damage control that the crew does immediately after, right? So you do things like shoring up, you know, flooded areas and counter flooding to get the list removed, so you don't capsize. And once you get things stable, you're going to pull into a temporary repair port. In the case of Indianapolis, there was an island west of Okinawa that we had some initial damage control capability, and initially they'll do things like remove bent screws that will impede your ability to get across the ocean. They'll maybe weld quasi-permanent patches over ruptured hulls, and they'll restore electrical systems, and they'll do what they need to do, assuming the ship needs to get to a place like Mare Island for more heavy repairs. And then the ship's crew takes the ship to the repair depot. And I'll use the Mare Island as an example for the Indianapolis, at which time, if it's going to be months for the repair to take place, they'll generally transfer a third, no more than a third, but generally no less than a third of the ship's crew to other postings, because other ships need replenished. There's battle loss in crews. So that third will be taken off and maybe supplant ships' crews that have lost men to battle. And you'll get a new third and they don't want to do more than a third because you've got to train these guys who've never been to sea before. And so in the depot, they'll do the permanent repairs. And at the same time, they'll upgrade weapon systems. So better radars, better guns, put some quad Bofors on that maybe if you didn't have them. So better air defense systems, better gun directors that we talked about, and improved damage control capability. So that's kind of the phased process that you go through. Then when you get underway, you got to train that third of the crew that's brand new, that's never been to sea again. And hopefully that gets you back into fighting shape.
Great answer. Seth, you got anything to add to that? Or I think you about summed that up, huh?
No,
Great job.
I do not.
John asked an interesting question. Was there any other officer being considered besides Nimitz to lead the Pacific campaign?
I saw that question. I think that's a great question. And the short answer is no.
Exactly.
Because after Pearl Harbor, FDR, none other than Franklin Delano Roosevelt tells Admiral King, tell Nimitz to get out there until the war is done, period.
Yep. A year before, FDR wanted Nimitz to take the Pacific Fleet. And Nimitz said, no, there are 50 other officers senior to me. I made that number up. And the worst thing you could do to me, Mr. President, is to cause me to bypass all those guys and get my 4-star command now. So FDR didn't do it. When Pearl Harbor was attacked, FDR said, I'm not taking any more excuses. Tell Nimitz to get to Pearl Harbor and stay there until that war is won. And so, no, Nimitz had no choice but to follow those orders.
Here's a simple
By the way, before we get off that one, imagine how the war would have gone if Nimitz had been the commander in Pearl Harbor when Pearl Harbor was attacked. You can go all kind of counterfactuals there, right? Maybe Nimitz would have had defenses in place that would have prevented the damage. Maybe he would have done the same thing that husband Kimmel did and would have been fired. Imagine then how the war goes, by the way. I hate to think of it.
Yep.
Simple one here. Chris wanted to know the picture that we have up that you used for the introduction. Where did you get that picture, Seth?
National Archives. When I worked at World War II Museum, every year, excuse me, not every year for 15 years, but every year for about 5-6 years straight, myself and some of my historians would go to College Park. This is in probably about 2006 through about 11 is when we were building the buildings, the main, like Road to Tokyo, Road to Berlin, because the World War II Museum did not, believe it or not, have an image library, did not have an image archive or moving image archive, no archival footage. So I went to myself, it's usually me and one other guy, Tommy Lofton, who's also been on our show, went to the National Archives, and we'd stay there for a week, and we would just sit there and scan photographs after photographs after photograph after photograph to build our archive. And we built that archive from 0 images to over 48,000 images, 48,000 images, and over 900 reels of archival footage. So that came from the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and it is a bad to the bone picture.
As a kid, I had that James fighting book of World War II ships.
James
I think
fighting
it's
ships.
on the cover. I think it's on the cover of that.
Maybe.
Could be, yeah.
Yeah. Facebook question. Thomas asks, why was the U.S. Navy so relatively inept at night fighting at the start of the war? Bill, help us dive into this one, because the Japanese
didn't
have like
train.
a training program for it. So what's
I mean, you train like you fight, right? And if you don't train for it, you're not going to be good at it. And the battleship admirals were used to optical sighting, and optical sighting works. You can do star shells and spotlights and things like that, but they don't work so well. And so they would do a lot of their training during daytime when they could see the target. Didn't have radar yet. So I don't blame them for that. But I do blame them for not thinking about how the enemy fights and training to that.
Well, that all comes into a lot of racism too, and it's true. The United States Navy did not think that the Japanese could ever do the things that they were doing in 1942 to us, off the shores of Guadalcanal and elsewhere. There was just this blind, view that there's no way that the Asian man could do what they were doing to us or could potentially do to us. And then, 100% right. You can't fight it if you don't know how to fight it. And that's why Bill and I have always called Guadalcanal the classroom, because we learned how to fight it there.
I did find this book called Fighting in the Dark, Naval Combat, 1904 to 1944. So just giving Thomas a book, if you're further interested in it, I found that for you. You may want to go check that out. It looks like
friend of ours, Trent Hone. Yeah, good book.
It seems to me the Japanese got very little value out of the battleships in the Second World War compared to the cost and time, materials, and fuel to produce them in the first place. Using the benefit of hindsight, how much better would the IG been just simply producing a lot more 8-gun cruisers in place of those battleships? This is from Scott from Colorado, Loveland, Colorado.
How much? Yeah. I mean,
Scott,
again,
go ahead.
No, go ahead, Bill.
I was going to say there's a Japanese movie called The Archimedes Principle, and that's a scientific expression. Naval architects will understand what that means, but it talks a lot about why the Japanese built Yamato, for example, and it's a Japanese movie, so it's not our view of it; it's their view of it. And I really recommend you watch it. Short answer, I think, is yeah. The cruisers would have been pretty good, but I'll let Seth answer that part.
I'm going to say that again. This goes back to who's leading your Navy. This is a battleship Navy, and I mean it was a battleship Navy, and they're going to build battleships. And again, you got to remember, especially the early part of World War II is being fought by the navies that were built in the 1920s and 1930s, and even before to some extent, to some with some ships. And of that era, the battleship was queen of the seas. The cruisers were the scouting force. The battleship was the uppercut. The cruisers were the jab. And to use boxing expressions, and that's essentially what it is. Would they have gotten more bang for the buck by building more cruisers? Yeah. Would we have gotten more bang for the buck by building more cruisers? I don't know how you could possibly build more cruisers than we did, but if you did, maybe. Because I mean, it's been proven for the most part that the most effective shore bombardment by the United States Navy was provided by cruisers and destroyers, not the battle wagons. Although it's impressive to see that big, the cruisers and the battleships were more accurate. I mean, the cruisers and the destroyers were more accurate, and they provided more effective firepower in shore bombardment. And then, of course, you do need battleships because, hey, we use them at Guadalcanal and Surigao Strait. So, I mean, they need to be there. But would they've got more bang for their buck? Probably. But, I don't know. That's a hard question to answer. And guys, Shawn, how many have we gone through so far?
That's the 30th question.
Wow. I never would have thought that Bill and I could keep our answers so concise as to get through 30 questions in this amount of time.
I don't know if that was concise. Yeah. I think we do have to wrap it up here, though.
We do. Well, guys, we are going to wrap this particular episode of the Q&A up, and we'll do another one because there's more questions we want to answer. And I know there's more in the inbox that we haven't gotten to yet, or that Shawn hasn't gotten to specifically. This has been fun. I've enjoyed this.
A lot of fun.
I did too. And I frankly was afraid of this. That we were going to be, I was going to have to dance or something.
No,
I don't think we did much.
I set you up with some sub captains early on to get your confidence up, Bill.
All right, good. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
Yeah, I hope we've done well. I think we have. I don't think we've said anything wrong. Might have said things you don't agree with, but that's life.
Somebody will point out something we said wrong, Seth. Don't worry about that.
I'm sorry, sir. The Corsair had 5 rivets as opposed to the 7 that you said it did.
Yeah,
I like that voice. You ought to do that a lot.
Well, we do that around here quite often when people say, "Well, it's wrong," whatever. Anyway, so that being said, I think we'll wrap this sucker up for this week. We'll continue this next week, and then we will jump into season 4. So with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. Give us a rating and review. We certainly would appreciate it. Like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. You already know the name of it. I'm not going to give it to you. If you have a question or a comment, not for the next show because it's too dang late, send it to unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrin, and I want to thank you very much for being here with us. Shawn, dude, thank you very much for being with us.
Awesome. Loved it.
Awesome. Yep. See you next week.
See you next week.
Bill, take us home, Bill.
And I'm Bill Tody. See you again next week.